Hello, East Brunswick. It's been now about 2 weeks since I did my last update to the public, and a lot has changed in the last couple of weeks. So first of all, I hope that everybody is enjoying the nice weather. As you know, over the last couple of weeks, the governor has allowed more and more businesses to be opening. And so now that we're in phase 2, and we could see that each parts of those phases are starting to go in place, you're seeing restaurants opening now to outdoor dining. Salons are opening actually as of today, and nail salons. And so more and more of our businesses are coming back to life. And I'm of course, hoping that all of us are out there to try to support our small businesses who have suffered tremendously during this COVID crisis and the pandemic that followed. As we stand at this particular time, we are at 667 COVID cases, and we've stayed steady at about 54 deaths here in East Brunswick, with close to 40% of those at long-term care facilities, mirroring what we've seen throughout the state. We've actually seen a couple of days actually go by now where we haven't had any cases reported at all. So we could see that the numbers are beginning to trail off. And as that's happening, you could see that the state is now allowing more and more businesses to open. You may also have noticed, and sometimes it's a little bit difficult for towns and local governments to deal with the manner in which some of these things opens. You'll often get an announcement from the governor, oh, graduations are going to be allowed, stores are going to be allowed to have people indoor with capacity limits, and salons. But then what'll happen is it could take days to weeks to actually get the guidelines that need to be put in place in order to implement any of those changes. So it will often unfairly look like local government is holding back on enacting some of these changes when in fact the guidelines to make them happen haven't been provided. Case in point was graduation, when it was told at the state level that they were going to allow graduations, and yet our own local Board of Education was reluctant to make any announcements because the guidelines that followed made it virtually impossible to do that, meaning that at the time you could only limit assembly to 25 people. So we would have had to have over 30 graduations. We'd be doing that all summer. So while the announcement was made, the guidelines may or may not make implementation of that promise even doable. This particular past weekend, we just got notice Friday, 4 o'clock, from the Department of Health that they were going to allow visitation at long-term care facilities. But the 11-page guidelines that came with it were distributed at 4 o'clock on a Friday to implement the opening on Sunday for Father's Day, which made it virtually impossible for most long-term care facilities to implement 11 pages of guidelines given at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And in fact, we got follow-up guidelines just this morning, which is after Father's Day. So, and I'm not blaming anybody. This is hard stuff that we're dealing with. Opening up the business after things have been closed this long, it's tough stuff. It has nothing to do with party, has nothing to do with politics. There's just a lot of rules and procedures that need to be put in place so that we can make sure that we're ensuring people's safety. And there's always an exception, and people will work that up the ladder to try to get clarification. So it's just tough stuff. So let's kind of hold off the negative, horrible, nasty comments that are on social media and give some of these legislators, people working at the grassroots level, a little bit of leeway to try to do the right thing. And we'll look back when this is all over and recognize that we've probably made some mistakes and could have done things differently. Some things we were right on and did exactly what we were supposed to do and saved lives. But this is a pandemic that we haven't seen in over 100 years. What we have at our disposal is so much different today than what they had over 100 years ago. So it is making it a little bit easier to manage. But let's have a little bit of heart and try to give people the benefit of the doubt. What I really want to spend most of the time talking about today are our township utilities. And the reason that I'm bringing that up is because I've heard over and over again over the last couple of months, why are we opening up the pool and not preferring that we just give it to East Brunswick residents? Why am I still being charged to use the parking utility out of my monthly pass when I'm not able to go to work? Why am I being charged so much more money for water than I have in the past? And I think the bottom line, the one thing that puts all of those things in a single thread is the fact that many of these areas are operated through what the township calls a utility. And a utility is different than the money that is operated different than the regular government departments and things that are run through your tax dollars. You think of a utility as a business, and everything that's done in that business or in that utility has to stay in that utility. So whether we're talking about the pool or whether we're talking about water or sewer or the parking utility, all of the costs for that utility must be borne by the users of that utility. And if there's a profit that's made in that utility, it must be invested back in that utility. So if the pool makes money, it's not as if we could take that money out and hire someone in another department or buy another piece of equipment or return it back to taxpayers in the form of tax relief. That profit must stay in that utility. And we have several of them throughout the township. And I think a lot of decisions, a lot of questioning of some of our procedures make it a lot more easier to understand if you understand the way in which utilities operate and why we have them as such. So like I said, the money and the cost of running a utility need to stay within that utility, and they must be self-liquidating, meaning that the costs of running the utility must be paid for by the users. And again, whether that's the pool or the parking deck or our water or sewer utility, they're paid for by the users. And only if that utility gets into such a bad financial position that it cannot cover its expenses or its debt does the town become the guarantor of that deficit and would then have to be responsible. And only in that situation could you make the claim that taxpayer dollars is going towards supporting that utility. To my knowledge, that has never happened. And even with the economic condition that we're in right now, it's our intention for that still to never happen. So let's go over our utilities, and we have 5. We have the pool utility, we have the parking utility, which are our parking decks, we have the water utility, the sewer utility, and we have a police range utility that's used for training police officers, and we market that to other towns or local units. Let's talk about the pool utility first. To be completely clear, the town did not purchase the land that the pool sits on. That was purchased through Green Acres money, which is money through the state that's used to leave areas in open space that are dedicated for public recreational use. And when that was done many years ago, that purchase was done through those dollars, and that property must be used for a recreational purpose, which at the time was, and is still to this day, a water park. That was determined many years ago. But under the rules of Green Acres, you cannot simply say that it can only be used by East Brunswick residents, because East Brunswick residents didn't purchase the property. It was purchased through state money, through Green Acres. Now you can preferentially treat East Brunswick residents by offering them a cheaper admission rate than you offer out-of-towners, but there's strict limitations on the amount of the difference. And you cannot look like you're favoring just East Brunswick residents. So that's one issue that most people don't really know. We don't own, the town owns the water park, but it wasn't purchased with your tax dollars. In addition, when we just got permission from the Department of Health to open up the water park, which was literally about a week to 10 days ago, part of that stipulation, in that stipulation, it specifically says that we cannot preferentially open the water park to just East Brunswick residents. Now, We could argue whether the Department of Health should even have the right to put that in their statement. Frankly, I think they should stay in their lane and only opine on the health and safety concerns as we open up a park in the middle of a pandemic, and making sure that the advice that they give us sticks to issues of health and safety. So I question whether they should be the one even making that statement, but that's part of the statement. And so we must comply. Now, in the past, the water park has primarily made its profits on, to be honest, people from out of town. They've paid more, and the daily rate was higher, and there was a lot of money that was made. Probably the biggest portion of profits traditionally for this park has actually come from out of town people who are utilizing the facility. And it's a real, I mean, we're very, very lucky. Our water park has been rated as the #1 public water park in New Jersey for several years now. So we should be very proud of the park that we've developed over the course of many years. And so it is something that is well known outside of East Brunswick, and many people travel from quite a large distance to use our water park. And again, most of our profits in the past have actually come from those users. This year, with the COVID crisis, we had to wait for the government to give us permission to open up the park. And unfortunately, we were actually behind most public pools, because a pool and a park are considered separate. Pools were just recently allowed to open. We are actually considered a water park, and amusement parks, arcades, things of that sort are, to this point, still only supposed to be opened in phase 3. So it took us a little time to get permission from the state to even open, because we were limiting our park to its pool uses, and that's the only condition under which the state allowed us to open. So on top of the fact that they were late in giving information out, we were particularly late in getting information from the state on whether or not we would open at all, because they were considering us a park. So the costs of running the park still remain very high, and that was something that the town's Parks and Rec Department and our Recreation and Park Advisory Committee was wrestling with for weeks leading up to this. We were kind of in the dark with what the state was going to allow, and then when they did allow us to open, it really had to take into account it's still a business. We've got bond money that has to be paid for some of our expenses. They're still due, and frankly, the bond payment on that was made back in January, February, before the whole crisis took place. So we're already out close to $400,000 on the bond payment. There's a cost that is incurred in opening up a park every year. There's a cost incurred in the pool supplies. There's a cost incurred due to COVID, meaning that we're going to have to hire more people. We're going to be limited on the number of people that are going to be allowed into the park. We're going to have to be doing a lot more monitoring of public areas, so more people. And every single year when we open up a park, there's training that needs to be provided to all of our lifeguards in order for us to meet all the requirements to run a park, and for our joint insurance fund to make sure that our people that are lifeguards are appropriately trained. This is still an important role that they're providing and could be life-saving. They need to have the proper training. These are all costs that have to come out before a dime comes in to this pool utility. And so with the limited number of people that we were going to be allowed to use the park, and the limited number of features within the park that you could use, it would be unfair to charge people a season pass for something that probably half of what the park could offer they can't even use. With our limited hours and limited capacity, we really just couldn't offer season passes. I also did make a comment earlier saying that we were going to do everything possible to make this something that we could provide for East Brunswick residents, maybe getting in an hour earlier, since we weren't really able to do anything with the rates. But it turns out that when we finally got the guidelines from the state on how to operate a pool utility in this pandemic environment, we were told that we would have to have equipment that allowed for people to enter without the use of any cards or exchange of any money. So the systems that needed to be purchased in order to be able to provide that does not have the capacity to only sell to East Brunswick residents or to limit who's coming in once you have a paid pass for the day, be basically a barcode, and there's no way that we could limit the first hour to East Brunswick residents. So the systems simply do not make it possible for us to honor what we were hoping to do this year, and that was to provide some sort of benefit to East Brunswick residents. What we are doing is trying to get the word out, such as formats as like this, social media. We're going to try to contact people on our email list to make sure that East Brunswick residents know that once the season is open, you could purchase your tickets ahead of time. And we're hoping that by getting the word out it naturally will flow to our local residents first. And so in that way, they'll have first dibs, so to speak, on tickets. But the requirements of Green Acres, the requirements of the Department of Health make it very difficult for us to do anything that would give an undue favoritism to our own residents. So despite our good intentions, we're going to do the best we can. But we need to try to make this season somewhat viable so that we can at least break even and cover our costs this year. So I think with that as a backdrop, it understands or hopefully you could understand why we made the decisions we did, why some of those thoughts that we might have had expressed earlier needed to change once the information from the state made it impossible for us to do some of those things. Because it's a utility, we also have the ability, and again, this goes back to the issue of why utilities are helpful to towns, that we could take some of our expenses that we normally run through as township expenses and take what we legally can use off through our utilities. So for instance, the energy costs or our insurance costs that total town costs that could be allocated to a utility can legally be deducted and paid for through that utility. Some of our professionals, such as our CFO or our revenue department, if some of their work is being dedicated to running a utility, then some of the costs, whether that be salary or benefits, for those individuals can be paid for through a utility. So in a fully functioning, profitable utility, we are actually helping taxpayers by taking some expenses that would ordinarily be run through the town and legally running them through the utility when those expenses can be justifiably placed in the column for a utility cost. What we're looking actually to do going forward with the pool utility is to rename that as a recreation utility as we look to put up the town's first hockey rink in the redevelopment zone off of Tice's Lane. That's probably going to be built in phases, ultimately 2 rinks for hockey or ice skating. And by putting it through a pool, changing the name of the pool utility to a recreation utility, then any recreational activities that could be run through legally through a utility helps taxpayers by, again, taking some of these expenses that would ordinarily be handled through tax-paying public and parking them to be covered by the cost of the people who are utilizing that utility. We may even do the same thing with camps. Because all of those could be legally and justifiably categorized as a utility cost under a recreation utility. So that's something we're looking to do down the line. Parking utility, that's utility number 2. We know, as you know, we own 2 parking decks, one of them by Tower Center, the other one by Walmart. Again, these are utilities. Taxpayers did not pay for those buildings. They were bonded for, and the cost of running them are paid for through the charge that we give to people that utilize those parking utilities. The parking utility was set up in a way that the pro forma for how the expenses, which include bonding to pay for the building, the personnel that operate it, their benefit costs, energy costs that are, and maintenance costs and insurance costs that all are legitimately placed under the heading of the utility are paid for by the money that comes in from the users of that parking deck. And the way in which they have always been established is that there would be a limited number of resident parking spots who right now are paying $30 per month for their spot, which is well under the market rate for public parking almost anywhere in New Jersey. There's also a portion that's set aside for non-resident parking. And again, it's a utility. We cannot overly favor East Brunswick residents. So non-residents have the ability to park and have reserved spots with a limited number for them. They pay $60 a month, so a whopping $720 a year. Again, well under the market rates for parking. And then the parking deck remaining spots are sold as $5 a day spots for daily users. And so if you use those 5 days a week, all during the year, those people are paying close to $1,200 a year for those spots. So clearly, the way in which the parking decks are made to operate is that they are overwhelmingly being supported and paid for by the people who are paying daily rates. And that's why there's such a long list of people who want public parking and do it through the reserved spots. But we only have a limited number of those spots. That's how the parking deck was made to function and to work monetarily without any extra costs being sent down to the township. Again, utilities must be paid by the users. So there, as a consequence, though, with the limited number of residential spots that we have, there's close to 300 people waiting on the list for a spot, and they've been waiting over 3 years. It's gotten so long at this point that the town doesn't even take any more names because the odds of somebody even getting a spot at this point is so remote. But what I have gotten, unfortunately, was a handful, and not a lot, of people who sent complaints who have their $30 a month reserved spot, complaining that because of the pandemic, the parking was closed because there were no buses going into the city. And therefore, they wanted to know if the township was going to refund them or the utility would refund them their money or just not charge them for the months that the parking deck was really not operating. And the short answer to that question is no in capital letters. Because you have a reserved spot. It gives you the right to use that spot at any time. And again, there's close to 300 people that would love to switch places with you, even if it's 3 or 4 months that you didn't pay, that you paid but didn't get to utilize the spot. You're still way ahead of those daily parkers. And while we're in a pandemic that happens once every 100 years, this is the rare time, the rarest of times, that we're actually depending upon the people who have monthly passes to cover most of the costs of that deck. It's almost always, 99% of the time, covered by the $5 a day people who are parking as daily parkers, who right now are saving money because they're obviously not going into the city. But even if things were to open up tomorrow, and even if some of those parkers who are taking daily spots only went back twice a week, which is what we're hearing may end up happening, that's still $40 a month that they would have to be paying to use this only 2 days a week, which makes that our daily parkers are still getting a better deal. So in all honesty, the 5 people who complained, 4 were from in town, 1 was an out-of-town resident, and tried as nice as I possibly can to explain to them that this is the benefit that they get. They will not be getting any refunds. They will not be told that they are going to have their charges suspended during this crisis. And when things go back to normal, the bulk of the costs, again, will be borne by our $5 a day daily parkers. And in all of this time, only 5 people have decided to give up their parking pass because most of them were retired and were really just keeping the spot at $30 a month. It was so inexpensive. But now that the COVID took place and they realized that they're not really going to be going back into the city on any regular basis, they gave up their spots. 5 people. And I can tell you that there were 5 people on that waiting list that were exceptionally happy and more than happy to pay the $30 a month while the businesses aren't really operating and they're not going into the city. Water utility. That's our third utility. It's kind of combined on your bill as water and sewer, but they're 2 separate areas, and the sewer's the fourth utility. As many of you know, in past December, the Township Council did vote to increase our water rates. And our water rates are something that, again, have to be paid by the people who are utilizing the service. It's a utility. And for many, many, many years, still even to this day with the increase, our water rates compared to almost every other town in New Jersey really is one of the lowest. But there are certain limitations on what the town can do with water rates. Number one, the town has to pass off the costs to the users. Our biggest cost for water, for the water utility, is the water. We purchase that from Middlesex Water, and we have to pay and purchase a minimum amount of water. That minimum is based on usage over the last 5 years. So they'll take a look at our usage over the previous 5 years, and whatever was the largest usage, probably some summer day in the middle of a drought, but that becomes your minimum water purchase that you're required to buy. Why? Because the state doesn't ever want a town to ever be in a position where it doesn't have enough water for residents and for any, God forbid, emergencies, fire included. And so the minimum requirement, whether you're doing the best job possible to limit your water usage, this town still has a minimum water bill that must be paid. Secondly, the cost of maintaining the system has to be borne by those of us who are using it. Newsflash, we live in New Jersey, and our infrastructure is old. And so just like your house, just like your businesses, all of these infrastructure has to be maintained. And so the cost of infrastructure repairs need to be included in your utility cost. And East Brunswick is facing 2 major issues that are going to require large capital outlays of money. And we bond for them and we pay for them over time. But right now, if we were continuing to go at the rate that we were charging, we would never have been able to cover our costs. What are those 2 big projects? Well, one, the main water line that comes to East Brunswick, and keep in mind, it's not only East Brunswick, but we also sell water to Spotswood and South River. So all of the supply comes from a main line that goes underneath Route 1, right near the border with North Brunswick. That main line is close to 75 years old and is teetering. In fact, it once broke a couple of summers ago, and we were down for the entire township, including the 2 that we sell water to, because of that main line going down. The cost of fixing that and providing a duplicate line so that we have the capacity to never be in a position where we're going to be without water or suffer some catastrophic event has to be something that we consider and put in place and pay for over the course of time. We can't ever take the risk that can happen. The damage to the township and the cost to us as taxpayers through our utility would be catastrophic if you had to do that emergently. Not the least of which would be it would cause a total shutdown of Route 1. So we just have to do that. We also have old meters which aren't running properly, and so the cost of ultimately replacing all the meters in town is a project that we simply have to plan for. So a lot of the money that's going towards this increase had to be not only for our usage costs, but also for the system costs. The cost of water itself keeps going up. Just this past, about 2 months ago, the state put PFOA requirements on water. So it's constantly being tested, whether it's lead or any other chemicals, and you get a bill included in your bill once a year. is the breakdown of all the things that's tested for in the water. Got to pay for that. It's not done for free. And every time they add something, it's just a cost that gets included in the cost of the water. So we do the best we can to keep the prices low. And even with the increase that we put through, we're still one of the lowest paying water bills in almost all of New Jersey. We could do what some other towns have done and to load that to a private company that manages water utilities, Suez being one, but there's others. Just take a look back last year with Edison and the public's response to offloading the water utility to Suez. First of all, private company is still going to have to invest in the infrastructure. They still have to pay for water, so all of those costs would still be borne by the users. And now you have a company with its own layers of administration that need to be paid salaries and benefits. And so at the end of the day, you're not any better off sending it off to an outside firm to manage. In fact, if anything, over time, it probably would end up costing you more money. So we do the best we can in the water utility. We try to charge as many things that can legitimately be charged to the water utility: equipment, personnel, insurance, and obviously all of the supplies. The other thing that is critical is that we're getting 50-50 funding from the state of New Jersey to redo all of the water lines up and down Route 18. We needed to bond for that, our 50% of that figure, and we didn't have the money in our fund balance in the water utility without putting through the tax increase. If we, not the tax increase, the increase in the water fees. If we had not done that, then we wouldn't have been able to put up our portion of the bond money for that work, and the state would not have contributed its 50%. And ultimately, when that work was done, we would be paying for 100% of that work. So I know people were not happy. No one's happy when a bill goes up. But let's understand the reasoning, the mechanism behind it, and compare ourselves to a lot of other towns where the water rates are significantly higher. And you don't really need to look far. Just look at the towns surrounding us who pay significantly more. And those that don't are going through the same process that we are, or just did last year, with looking at the systems, looking at their costs, and hiring consultants to give them advice on what to do. And I don't doubt for 1 minute they'll be in the same boat and come to the same conclusions that we have. With the sewer utility, it's kind of a ditto in terms of what I just said about the water utility. Again, the costs are borne by those of us that use it, both water and sewer. The vast majority, the larger costs, are being borne by industrial and commercial uses, because the pipes that go to the facilities, the work that needs to be done to discard and biodegrade a lot of the waste is just much more expensive. But keep in mind, we're 80% residential town. So the vast majority of money coming into those utilities are coming from residents, but the higher costs are borne by industrial and commercial sources. One thing that you should keep in mind is that when main water lines and main sewer lines go into a section of town, maintenance and management of that is definitely the utility's responsibility, and that's reflected in your bill. Frankly, you should look at your utility bills for the water and your sewer utility not much different than you look at your electric utility. You have a charge for your usage and a charge for the management of the system, and you should look at these utility bills as no different. So the main lines that go in and out of a neighborhood are managed by, paid for through the utility, and that's part of the system cost that's part of your bill. But the line that goes directly from the main line to your home, or the one that takes waste from your home back to the main sewer line, that's an individual business or resident's responsibility. And again, we have aging infrastructure, some homes that have been here for a long time, and every once in a while, some of those pipes break. that's a homeowner responsibility, and that could be very, very costly. I remember about a year ago, maybe even longer now, when East Brunswick Jewish Center had a main line break that went to the center, and they were all upset because they thought it was a township responsibility. And unfortunately for them, the main line for EBJC is on the opposite side of Riders Lane, more on the side by St. Bart's. So not only did they have to pay for the repair to the line, but they had to pay for the repair to Riders Lane to access the lines that are underneath the road. So I think people should keep in mind that they should make sure that your lines are being well maintained. And a cautionary word of advice, or maybe something that you might want to look into with your own homeowner's insurance, is that there's often riders that you could purchase, and they're very inexpensive, to add to your homeowner's insurance, which would cover you in the rare event that some of those pipes end up going and need to be repaired. It is well worth having that rider on your insurance if your carrier has that coverage. And then finally, the last utility that I wanted to talk about is our police range utility. Many of you may know that we have a range off of Tice's Lane, off of Hart's Lane, and that the police use as a training facility. That facility also is a utility. And so the cost for the officer and any non-officers that run that is paid for through the utility. And we utilize that utility for other towns, other local units, other private companies that need to maintain security services, air marshals, so there's several organizations and groups that actually rent out that facility and pay us for utilizing it and the type of training that we're able to provide. So that's, while it doesn't make a ton of money, it is also operating as a utility. And so it helps, again, pay for some expenses that we can legitimately write through utility as being fair and legitimate utility costs. So I'm hoping that helps clarify some questions and concerns and comments that I see either stated or written on social media when people will say, well, my tax dollars are going to pay for that. Why don't I get a benefit from it? Utilities are not paid for with your tax dollars. They're paid for by the users of that utility. And in many instances, you are not allowed to segregate preferences for people in your own town, and if you do so, there's limitations on how much you can do in terms of preferential treatment to township residents. So I'm hoping that clears up some information. I like most of you, I would never have understood that if I hadn't been in government. Like many of you, it would often have sort of say guilty as charged when I would have said, well, my tax dollars pay for that, or with all the taxes I pay, why can't I get X, Y, or Z? Those comments are made everywhere in every town, and in New Jersey, which is a high tax state, I get why people make those statements. But at the end of the day, the fact that we have these utilities and that they're working and in a way in which it helps the users of that utility, but also as a byproduct, it helps the township in many instances save on some expenses that would ordinarily be charged 100% to the township. So I hope that helps. I look forward to seeing you at restaurants and hopefully in some of the retail establishments and the malls that are going to be opening up real soon. And I plead and hope that each one of us living here in the township do everything that we possibly can to try to support these businesses as they kind of come out of hibernation and back into business. They are the lifeblood of the township, besides all of those yourself, the residents that make up this great diverse township. And stay safe and stay well.